So a bit of background, I'm an educationalist. I'm very interested in AI and education, and my disciplinary background before education is English literature, English linguistics. Um, and what I'm interested in is this discourse that you find in university guidance, and I can only really speak about um, English-speaking universities, though of course English is used across the world, but it'd be interesting to see what other people's guidance is in universities, how students are meant to act ethically and responsibly in relation to use of AI. And I thought it would be useful to get some provocation around those concepts because they tend to be just intuitively understood. And I thought I'd go to a couple of philosophers who talk about ethics and responsibility just to get some provocational value out of those philosophers and to move this discourse forward if possible. Um, so a little bit of brief scene setting. Of course, we're in a revolution. I mean, I think that, and I'm sure lots of other people here think that, although you'd be surprised when I talk to colleagues in not just in my own university, but other universities, they're not necessarily buying into AI or using it. But universities were certainly surprised by this rapid advance at the end in generative AI at the end of 2022. And so, not surprisingly, a lot of the guidance was reactive about protecting academic integrity with the need for students to act ethically and responsibly in relation to their usage of AI. In the meantime, certainly in the UK, we're meant to be promoting AI literacy. It's seen as a rising employability skill. And inevitably then, this university messaging is either seen as mixed, or perhaps it is mixed, because there's a lot of do's and don'ts. And I know from talking to students that they are rather confused about it, because on the one hand, they're being told AI is valuable for their careers, yet the university is restricting its usage. And another problem is, just echoing what I just said, some people, like people here, are really excited about the possibilities, but some colleagues, but others are not using it and are thinking, well, this is really a bit of a nuisance. It's disrupting my brilliantly conceived assessment structure. I'm actually using vivas with the students to make sure that they actually conducted that piece of work. So I thought, well, maybe we can think about ethics and responsibility less intuitively and really kind of ground what ethical use of AI is and responsible use of AI is in philosophy to get past this mixed messaging and confusion. My own interests in education are very much creative thinking. I run modules that enhance students' creative thinking. And one of the reasons is this is just an important life skill. But interestingly, it's a rising employability skill from the recent World Economic Forum jobs report. And flexibility and agility are rising employability skills. And one of the reasons for this is pretty obvious. Employers want to know what to do with AI and all this new intelligent tech, and of course, emerging all the time. So for provocational value, I thought I would turn to a couple of philosophers who talk about ethics and responsibility, the ones I've mentioned. These are Gilles Deleuze and Kieran Barad. And one of the reasons for going to them is they are very much philosophers of interrelation and connection. Deleuze uses the term assemblages, Barad uses the term entanglements, but the way they see life is that everything is connected in some kind of way. Okay? And the key connection here is student AI interrelations. What could they become? What are their possibilities? And interestingly, they're linked by love of hats as well. And also, the human agent is not necessarily in control within this network, within the assemblage or the entanglement. The human agent may be dissented. And I thought, well, that's interesting in relation to thinking through what student AI interrelations might be. So I'll start with Deleuze in relation to ethics, and then Barad in relation to responsibility, and bring them together and give an example of my own pedagogy where I'm using these ideas. So Deleuze, now Deleuze can be very difficult, right, for anyone who's ever grappled with him, the later Deleuze, but the earlier Deleuze is much more accessible. And he makes this interesting distinction between ethics and morality, which in everyday discourse are pretty much synonymous. Okay, and it's interesting when you go to the AI guidance on university websites, you don't find this term moral so much. It's generally the students are expected to act ethically, all right, and maybe that's because moral has other kind of overtones, perhaps religious. But we would understand the propositions, he is an ethical man, he is a moral man, is pretty much very convergent. Okay, so he makes a simple distinction between the two, and this comes out in his book on Spinoza, which is a practically oriented book from philosophy, and to some extent with Nietzsche, where morality is about the fixed rules of conduct. Okay, so universal perhaps across a society, or universal across an organization like a university, where it's not good to cheat. Why? Because of course you're cheating yourself in the long run. You know, you should engage with integrity in an academic program, and that kind of morality, this rule-governed morality, maps quite easily onto legality. So of course there are punishments in a university, there's a quasi-legality system, and a student, you know, may lose their place in a university if they're caught cheating. Ethics is very different. Ethics is about opening up life and its possibilities, maximizing the potential and the becoming of life, not just human life, but all the possibilities that could ensue on the biosphere. And you can't maximize your potential at the expense of another, all right? Because then you're reducing the possibilities of life. So you would then intervene if you can. So to be ethical is to intervene, to open up the possibilities of whatever life is, how it is being conceived. And of course, to intervene comes with all sorts of complications and difficulties. Ethics for Deleuze also relates to the assemblage, because everything's connected for Deleuze. So no human is living in a vacuum. Humans are in communities with other humans, but obviously not with just humans, but with non-humans, pets, and so on. And all sorts of possibilities for an assemblage. Of course, the biospherical aspects of the assemblage, we're dependent, of course, on this planet for our existence. And from the more micro perspective, humans and their use of technology. And thus, to be ethical is opening up the possibilities of the assemblage, which may involve reassembling these networks, creating fresh assemblages for new creativity to emerge. And creativity in this ethical perspective, where there is new becoming, is always emerging for Deleuze. It's not creativity that comes with some sort of pre-design. It's about opening up the possibilities for fresh forms of creativity to arrive. Okay, so what would a Deleuzean pedagogy then look like in relation to generative AI? Well, of course, there would be many possibilities. Okay, so this is just one way of looking at it. In the current guidance, there's this stress still, the student must be acting ethically. For Deleuze, that would be acting morally, because it relates, of course, to the quasi-legality of a university. From a Deleuzean outlook, it's the educator that must act ethically. Okay, and of course, the educator meaning the individual lecturer, but the whole infrastructure of the university supporting that ethical outlook. So what would that mean? Well, they have to realize this new potential. Okay, so for example, at King's, we're a Microsoft university. All the students have got access to Copilot, but many lecturers are not involving the student in that interrelation, in that assemblage with Copilot. It doesn't necessarily occur to them because they're not necessarily that interested in AI. Others are bringing in Gen AI into the seminar. But we would be actively engaging, all of us, with that potential. And of course, that potential will be different in different disciplines and different teaching environments. Another part of the Deleuzean outlook is that the educator is not outside of the student AI assemblage. Okay, so you're not, outside of the teaching. You're in the assemblage, and because you can't keep up with AI alone, no lecturer can. It's moving far too quickly. There's too many tools. So the only way around that is to have spaces where you're flattening the hierarchy. Of course, you've got to keep that hierarchy of lecturer-students because you are in the, gatekeeping their lives by marking their assignments. But there has to be a flattening of that structure somewhere where you're open and say, well, I can't keep up to date with all of it. Let's co-experiment. And so they are learning from your experimentation, and you are learning from them as well. So it's a co-creative experimental assemblage that needs to take place, and that will infuse what you do with the module down the line. So it's useful to hear from the students in these formative experiments with AI. There needs also to be AI agility in assessment. We're meant to, in the UK, because we have to speak this language of employability, we're supposed to help students. So I don't have a problem with that at all. And of course, these skills of agility and creative adaptability are great life skills anyway. But there must be room in assessments for students to show their agility, to go outside of the module, to make links with maybe AI tools they haven't been discussed in the module, maybe making links with how AI is being used in different domains outside, in my case, the humanities, could be in health, and somehow bring that into what they're doing so that it re-angles their use of AI in a productive way, and also fosters this adaptability. So I think that's really important for them to be constantly engaged with different forms of AI as much as that is possible. And then inevitably cheating, this thing that we're with the moral outlook of the university, that AI must be used morally in Deleuze's term. Well, the cheating with AI will diminish because you're expected to use AI and show your creativity in your interrelation with AI. So that's Deleuze and ethics, and one set of implications for a pedagogy that's Deleuzean with using Gen AI. Come to Kieran Barad, who has this concept of responsability. Now, Kieran Barad also has this ontology, the way she sees the world as being all networked and everything interrelated. A lot of her ideas come from her engagement with quantum mechanics, of which I cannot speak with any authority. But I know that there are a number of quantum physicists who find what she does, this scaling up of the quantum strangeness and weirdness of that world to the macro world, somewhat problematic. But I'm using her ideas provocationally, just like with Deleuze. It's not like I buy into everything in Deleuze or buy into everything in Kieran Barad, but they're interesting provocational tools, these concepts. And one of her concepts is this concept known as intra-action, which is contrasted with interaction. So, of course, in the macro world, we engage in the classical mechanics in some kind of way, in that we're using cause and effect all the time. So to turn on my computer, I obviously have to press the button. There's an effect. The computer boots up. She's interested in where agency merges and is emergent between human and non-human. And so she's writing in her book, Meeting the Universe Halfway. This is about 18 years ago. This is obviously pre-generative AI, but you can see this use of interaction is productive into how we're using technology to outsource much of our decision making to some degree, in that so many of us are using map apps like Google Maps, which is then sending us back information. And if we're prompted from that information, well, the agency is somewhere between us and the map app. She also has this term responsability, and obviously punning on responsibility, where she stresses ability. And since we're completely entangled with the world in all sorts of ways, economic, social, political, technological, the responsible person is someone who is giving it as much thought as possible to think through where we are entangled. So where we might also have choices to foster productive entanglements. So from a very simple perspective, we're down in the supermarket and we're actually thinking about the product, what its supply chains might be, where there might be exploitation of human workers, and so on. And of course, one human being is limited in their power, but it might be possible to find some wiggle room in our entanglements and have a more productive outcome rather than drifting passively along. So what would that look like in relation to pedagogy using generative AI? What would a Baradian pedagogy look like with Gen AI? Well, it's about setting up pedagogies where the students actively have to make decisions about their use of AI, okay? Which might sound very, very trite, but already students are becoming passively accepting of Gen AI. I've seen it. It offers easy solutions, easy answers, okay? And of course that comes with problems because we know that the AI tools hallucinate. So it's very important to get that decision making, that critical decision making, and where the students can disentangle from the AI, not using it passively, and find productive entanglements which enhance that ability. So that's ability to find productive entanglements with AI. And because my interest is creative thinking, I want students to actively think through some pretty difficult issues, all right, which are difficult issues which are going to follow them throughout life. When is human creativity on its own enough? It doesn't need enhancement from AI. When should it be enhanced by AI? When is non-human creativity that produced by AI useful? Okay, so thinking through that interrelation, that entanglement, and when it's important for the student to be in charge, that's really, really important. But when should the students engage with it interactively in the same way we're using Google Maps? When we want the AI to prompt us to do something that we can't do so well, and this is how I'm using AI in my teaching in an aleatory way. Alea meaning dice in Latin, where it disrupts your human creativity and can offer new possibilities. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. But it's also important as part of this decision making around AI to appreciate unproductive entanglements. We all know now about the biases in AI and of course the hallucinations. But again, with students, I'm showing them how hallucinations can be productive because an AI hallucination can be conceived of as a creative accident in the same way that many a painter has spilt their coffee, their tea or whatever on their painting on the canvas and gone, oh, that's terrible, and then rethought it and thought, actually, that's interesting, what's happening with the paint and with the way in which the colors are dripping and merging, something new is emergent. So it's important for them to be engaged with the things that we tell the students that are really bad about AI. Actually, they can be reconfigured. So this strategic entanglement engagement is really important, knowing the difference between productivity and unproductivity. And another thing that I've started with the students is strategic disentanglement to foster responsibility. And so I'm running 2-hour sessions in my modules, and in the 10-minute break, I say, right, leave the room. I want you to go walking, leave your mobile phones. I'll look after them. And they get a bit grumpy, right, because they're so entangled. But I said, this is really good for you. There's loads of research which says that physical exercise and creativity go hand in hand because you're oxygenating, you're optimizing your neurotransmitters through movement. And then they come back to the session and thus are more creative in their response to AI rather than staying in the room, slumped in the chair. That's no good. So that's a bit of a battle at the moment, but I think it's important because it's not being reactionary. It's actually saying you're going to be better in your engagement with AI. You're going to have more responsibility if you are charged, humanly charged. Okay, let me then give you an example of something I do, just a couple of slides. Students creatively interpret short stories. This is in a year 2 undergraduate module, and this is to enhance their creative thinking. It's open to students across the university. I've tried to make it as accessible as possible, partly because I want students from wherever, engineering, law, medicine, to come in and foster their adaptability by doing something different in relation to creativity, and hopefully that will help them in their engagements with AI. In their particular disciplines. So it's an assemblage-based approach where they make fresh connections around a short story to emerge creative interpretation. So in their assemblage, of course, there's the student, there's the canonical short story. It's usually canonical, ones that people keep returning to because there's lots of ways of interpreting them. They use AI to brainstorm research literature. They can find existing literary criticism on the story, which they redeploy. They get some ideas about how it was engaged with by a literary critic, and then they use that, redeploy it for a different part of the story that hasn't been discussed in that literary criticism. They can also brainstorm psychological research, which is indirectly related to the story, but can open up the psychological motivation of a character, potentially their pathology. And they also use simple text analysis software for finding things like frequent words and phrases in the story, and that thus they're getting into the design of the story. And it's in this assemblage, this network of possibilities where they're continually re-seeing the story, that they're having to make some kind of coherence. And they're going through all sorts of different routes through this non-linear assemblage. And it's through that non-linear interpretive set of pathways that they find something different, right? They've moved beyond what they knew about the story, moved beyond their intuitions, and they're engaging with it from a fairly singular perspective. And once that interpretation is burgeoning, that's where we bring in the AI as an aleatory tool to shape things up. So one thing they can do is they can load up what they've written so far and load that up to Gen AI and say, how could I exploit the story even more? Because that story is, if it's canonical, is already in the large language model, if it's written, in the 19th century, although they can load up the story as well, of course. And it gives them ideas, possibilities, but they have to engage with those possibilities critically, or they can just very simply do this, which works really well. They get Gen AI in this kind of final stage to summarize the story, and that can often flag important themes that they've missed. And that sends them back to the story to make new linkages between aspects of the story they hadn't properly engaged with their burgeoning interpretation. So that's the basis of that particular module. So how does that relate to Deleuze and Barad? Well, the aleatory use of generative AI is ethical and responsible, I would argue. From an ethical point of view, in relation to Deleuze's work, it's augmenting the assemblage. It's prompting further emergent creativity. Okay, so creativity the student didn't know they had, because the whole point with this creative interpretation of a short story is they're not coming in with an idea which they then confirm through using all these different aspects of the assemblage. They don't know where they're going. The whole point is to prompt them into fresh creativity. It's responsible from a Baradian point of view because they have to engage with lots of different outputs from AI. Some of it won't be that useful. Some of it won't be a good, interesting shake of the dice. So they can choose another AI tool. And eventually they've got to find something that works for what they're doing. And so there's a lot of rejection and a lot of pursuit, but a lot of thus critical engagement with AI for their purposes. Okay, so I'm coming to the end now. Just one more slide. Hopefully, in the short space, I've tried to move this conversation around ethics and responsibility. My focus here is the creative educator, but everybody can be in a university, be a creative educator. So what are we as educators? We are ethical assemblage facilitators. We ought to be ethical from a Deleuzean point of view to opening up the fresh possibilities of engaging with AI. Of course, that's going to differ from teaching context to context, from discipline to discipline. It all depends on what you're teaching. But inevitably, I think this leads to different forms of process-based pedagogy. So pedagogies and assessments that are in different stages, where you can bring in the generative AI in a different way. I'm using it in an aleatory way towards the end of a particular process. At that stage, obviously, different people will have different usage. But it's to develop entanglements, and developing an entanglement means you've got a problem. The students have got to find some way of creating an outcome from that entanglement. And that means that they're working hard, their brains are working hard, they're not reliant completely on the AI to sort out the problem. It's helping with that problem, but you're not completely reliant on it. That's good, because you're clearly developing your own thinking skills to prompt your emerging creativity. I think also, echoing what I said earlier, there has to be a level of flattening of the hierarchy somewhere in the curriculum to really embed some experiment and just be open and say, look, we're all in this together. None of us completely can be on top of AI. Let's engage in the shared practice of creative becoming. And then that enables the student to have some agency in this, rather than them just completely swallowing your model. We want them not to completely do that. We want them to think for themselves, and hopefully they will be engaged creatively in that matter of experimental assemblage. And then finally, I think it's important with AI in enhancing their agility to have spaces in an assessment where the students can experiment with other possibilities that weren't taught, to understand that it's in their interest to go beyond the generative AI that they were engaged with, and to prompt emergent creativity in a different way, as you know, and as well to see how AI is used in other domains and possibly bring that in as well. Okay, so my final slide, if you have any interest in these ideas, I wrote a paper where I engaged with Barad and Deleuze and very much kind of model, elaborate this pedagogical model in this paper.
Thank you very much for your exciting talk. We will leave questions for the end of the session. So now I will invite Dr. Chahna Gonsalves. She will be asking a question if we are strengthening learning with AI or distorting it, and I'm looking forward for potential answers.
Okay, hi everyone. I am just going to share my screen. Okay, so I've been debating this question about the impact that we are having on learning with our integration of AI. I wanted to, first of all, give a little bit of context to our participants. I'm senior lecturer in marketing education at King's. I don't claim to be a computer scientist. My interest in Gen AI is through my PhD research, which largely centered on text analysis, and that led me to an interest in large language models. But also, since we have been using ChatGPT, I really have been forced to redesign all of my assessments for various reasons. And I'll take you through some of those experiences and some of the lessons and questions that has led me to along the way. So given that we're now 2.5 years into using AI in education, I wanted to present this perspective, which is largely shaped by the UK context, so the policy that we work with, and King's being quite unique in that it was one of the first institutions to share its policy for student, staff, and graduate teaching assistants publicly. And that is also informed by the Russell Group principles of us supporting students and staff to use AI. So in theory, we were never supposed to ban it. Now, at the time that ChatGPT was launched, I was teaching 3 modules. In one of those modules, it was a second-year undergrad grad management module, which had 2 10% multiple choice quizzes. I inherited these quizzes. They were not my choice to have them, but these were largely simple multiple choice tests to ensure that the students were doing the textbook reading. So the questions largely centered on main concepts in the textbook. At the time, of course, the students actually spoke publicly about the fact that they were not planning to read or study, that they would use ChatGPT to answer these tests. And I walked in on them the night before the last tutorial, before the test, with one of the students saying to another, "Oh, you don't need to study. I'll just teach you how to use ChatGPT, so you'll pass." Now, the students didn't know that I had redesigned the test to ensure that each question constituted a small case study and that they would be required to work through a series of reasoning steps in order to get to the answers. Now, this was quite an insightful, but also, I guess, a slightly vulnerable moment in my teaching experience. So of the two tests, I designed them in similar ways, but I did make a few mistakes in the first test, where some of the questions were slightly too long and required quite a lot of effort for the students to get through all the questions. Also, I hadn't grouped the questions together so that questions of similar length would appear together. And that meant that a few students saw some really long questions at the beginning and lost quite a lot of time. Now, what the results did show was that I moved from quite an even distribution to quite a separation between those students who didn't succeed. And for context, the pass mark for these students is 40 out of 100. So in the second test, there was quite a big division between those who did very well and those who failed. Clearly, they hadn't done the reading and didn't have any context. Now, this test, despite these minor mistakes and the fact that I was able to iterate and improve on these in subsequent executions of the test, the students gave me additional feedback. So for example, one student said, you know, the cases were very interesting, and by reading these cases, I was able to read and learn more. So I started to ask myself, how can we use AI to enhance learning? Now, these are pedagogical questions that we have been asking from before ChatGPT, but how was the integration of ChatGPT helping to enhance or distort learning? At the time, so this was by now about February 2023, I had colleagues and I was seeing other posts online of people proposing pedagogical approaches that we could use to ensure that students were really engaging with their assessments. One of those, and this is from a colleague, so I know he won't mind me using this, was, for example, to not tell students how many correct answers to select in a multiple choice test, so that they would really have to engage and understand. Now, in this particular paper, my colleague found that that didn't necessarily enhance cognitive load for the students. So this was quite an interesting finding. But equally, there were LinkedIn posts like the one that you see on the screen, where, you know, academics were coming up with all kinds of ways to catch students out if they just happen to submit the assessment brief to ChatGPT and return the output. Now, I wondered, are we really enhancing learning, or are we now trying to find methods that distort the very goals that we're trying to achieve with the students? And I think we need to consider this question very carefully. There have been a few research papers that have collated some of the, let's say, more innovative approaches to AI integration. And one of these on screen, this was a review of policies, resources, and guidelines across a number of universities. And I really like this table where I think they have truly captured a lot of the techniques that we were encouraged to use at early stages, where, for example, we as academics were told to ask our students to analyze and evaluate the AI output. We were told to have them compare and contrast different versions of an answer, and ask students to revise and edit some of this information. Now, I've highlighted these because I would say that in my context, these are some of the common suggestions that academics were sharing with each other. But in many of our disciplines, this is not how students would engage with examples of knowledge. They wouldn't engage with this as practice. And certainly for me as a marketing lecturer, these are not the kinds of tasks that marketing students would use unless they were in a very specific area like marketing communications, where they would be maybe looking at how to write persuasive copy for an ad. This led me to question whether these techniques are really helping us to achieve the learning goals that we claim we're setting out to achieve with the students. And I think one of the considerations behind these trends is that actually these activities are very easy to integrate. So there has become a slight emphasis on us integrating the tools, helping our students to become familiar with using them and actively engaging with them in our classes, but those are not necessarily aligned with the learning outcomes of our specific modules and disciplines at times. Now, many of the universities, of course, move towards writing their own guidelines and trying to implement many of these frameworks for us as academics to understand what is considered acceptable. Now, on the left-hand side of the screen, we have King's approach, where we had 3 levels of instruction for educators. So we have no use of AI in controlled conditions like exams. We have hybrid conditions where it's up to the module leader to decide whether students will use AI in class and maybe be encouraged not to use it for certain tasks. But also then we have project-based coursework type assessments where, you know, it is assumed that students will use it. In addition to this, we have this really popular framework from Michael Perkin and Leon Furs and colleagues, where they have, initially this was described as the traffic light system, and I'm sure you're all really familiar with this. It's so widely adopted at this point. But it was quite interesting that we were kind of gravitating towards these frameworks of suggesting what is acceptable and what isn't, which also included elements that we couldn't police. So we might say to students that when we encourage them not to use AI, but we have no actual mechanism of ensuring they don't. And so this led me to another question as to whether we were doing this because we hadn't really decided for ourselves in our disciplines what acceptable use would look like and what the challenges are with drawing a line. You know, there are a number of questions that we need to answer for ourselves, and actually by avoiding it entirely, we're perhaps not forced to do that. So a couple of other studies that also picked up on this, and I do think this is really interesting if you happen to be designing policy for your institution, or even just considering where you might be enhances versus hindering students learning in your specific modules. King's introduced our policy, and our policy had 3 golden rules. One of those was that the student would be required to acknowledge their use of AI. Yet in the policy, we hadn't actually specified where they would make this acknowledgement or how. So I conducted a study with students. We subsequently introduced a revision to a coursework cover sheet. So it was assumed that in assessment projects, students would declare their use, and the cover sheet just included a small section to ask which AI applications have you used and for what types of tasks. So they could tick whether they used it for rewriting, for example, or ideation. Up to 74% of our students in the business school were not completing this section. So they would submit the cover sheet and leave that blank. And they were quite clear about the fact that the reason they were not completing this was because they didn't trust us. They felt that by signaling their use of AI, they were putting their work under the spotlight, that we might grade them more harshly. And also one student even said, you know, if I don't declare my use of AI and my work is great, the teacher will think I'm a genius. But if I don't acknowledge it, you know, they might scrutinize it in a different way. So there were a number of reasons, and a lot of it did center on this lack of trust and the fact that the policy wasn't quite clear about what is acceptable, where we would draw the line, and how misconduct would be judged and subsequently treated. Now, there's recently been another paper from Thomas Corbin, Phil Dawson, and Danny Liu, which really picks up on this, the fact that we have introduced a number of I guess, superficial approaches to suggest that we are instructing students on the use of AI and also attempting to police it, but we have created an illusion of enforcement. And actually, we haven't actually dealt with what is appropriate at the subject level, and also how we can enforce the use of AI across institutions in a way that is actually valid for assessment. So if you're interested, I would encourage you to read these papers. Now, there was another interesting paper from last year where some authors, they reviewed the policies of 104 of the US universities, and found that 67.4% of those universities offered Gen AI resources for faculties, but only nearly a fifth of them offered resources for students. And I think this is also true of many of our institutions in the UK as well. So the question here is, even if we are trying to instruct students to use AI, have we really thought about the resources and the support and the scaffolding that students require in order to use it in a way that is actually beneficial to their learning, and also in alignment with the policies that we put forward? Many of these universities had an instructor decides policy, so up to 47% of them, where the student was only allowed to use it with explicit instruction from the module leader. And I would say that it's been my observation in the UK too, that even with institutional policy, we still have another number of academics who are debating what is appropriate within their module, and as a result of that, not necessarily being very clear with students about how they could use it in the, for a given assessment and where they should draw the line. Now, there is the possibility of us adopting this very cautious approach, but I think in order to really enhance learning and not distort it, what we need to do as academics is speak to each other about what might be appropriate based on our values. I think our values and our expertise is very key in the way that we teach, and also in a particular assessment, that you could change your mind from assessment to assessment. So I think it's important for us to be able to articulate why we consider a certain line to be appropriate for a student at a given time. And if we can explain that to colleagues, it makes it a lot easier to explain it to students. Now, I did another study with academics at King's Business School, where I really just wanted to see how they were talking about AI. And this study was conducted in 2024. So from this study, I revealed a number of metaphors that the academics were using to describe AI. And overall, what this revealed was the number of tensions that we are really I guess, considering and addressing in real time when trying to integrate AI into our modules. And there are a few of them that I want to highlight. I think by now these metaphors are quite popular, so you can guess what most of them really refer to. But one of them was AI as an unintended burden. And I think this is something that we need to really consider in terms of supporting colleagues and managing both colleagues and students' well-being in integrating AI, because actually many colleagues see this as such a challenge that they would rather avoid it, but they also find it stressful to deal with when they have cases that they find hard to assess because they don't know what decision to make, and then they have students pushing back based on, thinking that perhaps they've met the brief and they really haven't, but now because they're convinced that AI is good enough, they feel more confident about challenging academics. And the second metaphor I'd like to bring your attention to is AI as an escalator, and this idea of the atrophy that happens if you don't take the stairs. Now, in our specific modules, we might value the development of certain cognitive skills, competencies, and I guess knowledge bases, but only we can really start to surface what those are. So just like maths teachers back in the 80s, I think we need to decide what is critical for students to understand in a particular discipline, and then how we might scaffold or integrate the use of AI from there. As I mentioned, these maths teachers who protested the use of calculators back in the 1980s, I think it's important not just for us to bring up this debate. We often hear the comparison of AI to the calculator, and I don't quite agree that it's the same, because AI is very democratized. You can have no knowledge of it at all, and you can use it for the first time. It will give you impressive results. But what these maths teachers really did do, and I think it's important for us to credit them, was with redesigning a curriculum that kept calculators out of the classroom before the lower levels of education. Now, we can't really do that in the same way with AI, but what we can do is start to identify a renewed structure of our curriculum to really be able to separate what students need to know, what would they need to know if they had no internet, no access to their mobile phone, and how do we build that given that they now have access to so much more knowledge than previously. I think we need to reconsider the different types of learning in order to enhance it and not distort it. And I think, you know, we all have very different, again, values and philosophies around education and our specific disciplines. And I think if you could take a moment to ask yourself, do you take a constructivist approach where you're really building prior knowledge? Do you think that students should learn from experience, for example, that they should learn from their affect and their emotions once they are in a learning experience? Or do you see learning as a more hierarchical approach? Now, I appreciate Bloom's taxonomy is not a hierarchy, but I'm using that just as an idea that students move linearly through a series of skills, even if that movement then becomes dynamic. So how do you scaffold your approach to learning, and what are the hierarchical or the fundamental dependencies that exist there? These are the kinds of questions that we might start to discuss with each other. There's been a lot of discussion about us trying to develop students' evaluative judgment. And while this is something that has been pedagogically important for many years, there are many of us as academics who don't have this education background. We come in from our disciplinary stance and maybe are not as clear about how we develop skills like evaluative judgment. So this is a student's ability to judge the quality of their own knowledge, their ability to discern what is good enough, for example, and also their confidence in doing that. And evaluative judgment as a skill is becoming even more important because actually Gen AI models are not necessarily as effective as students may believe. So I'd like to play this very short video for you of Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, who recently made a statement about the kinds of judgments we will need to make. So I'll play this now. So I think students really don't necessarily understand the limitations of large language models and why skills like evaluative judgment are so important. Now, I think we can generalize in that, students across the board are quite impressed with the outputs that they get, often thinking that those outputs are good enough and perhaps assuming that those outputs are better than they might be able to produce themselves, but they're certainly quicker. And they don't, I guess many of them don't necessarily follow the ins and outs of the developments with the large language models that they're using to understand that even the developers of these models are talking about the limitations and the need for evaluative judgment. So in terms of enhancing learning as opposed to hindering it, I think we need to go back to these original learning models and think about some of the new skills that we might be developing in students when we assess, some of the new skills that they are employing while they're using AI to complete their assessments, even if that is not what we want them to do, but also how we might use new skills to set new learning outcomes. Now, as a brief overview, I conducted a study in 2023 with MSc students who were on a marketing theory and practice module. They had to develop their own product and brand, and they were allowed to use AI over the 4 weeks of the coursework development period. In that time, they were allowed to use ChatGPT in addition to image generation models. There was no limits, but the free version of ChatGPT was what was available at the time. And these students kept audio diaries. So every time they worked on their coursework, they spoke about the prompts that they were inputting, what they considered to be valuable, not valuable, and what they would go on to ask. And they were really using this as a think aloud protocol. within the, say, more than 5.5 hours of raw data that I obtained from these students, I identified that they were using all of the Bloom's taxonomy skills, but they were also using additional skills such as the melioration of tools and technologies. So they were using traditional tools and combining them with AI. They would go from AI to Google Scholar, or they would go from DALL-E to Canva to build out their customer personas, for example. They were also meliorating the information, so combining the information from AI with more traditional sources like their lecture notes and textbooks. They were doing this in a very iterative way, which I think that sounds very obvious now for those of us who are using AI often. And, you know, this idea of really articulating their prompts, which I distinguish from prompt engineering, the idea of developing your thoughts in a clear way to give an instruction. This was a really important skill that even the students were aware of. Now, I would say that they were also thinking quite ethically and in a number of the steps that they were taking, and really questioning whether they were happy with this information, whether it's good for them to use it. So we can't make assumptions about what students are doing, but in order to enhance their learning, I think we need to work more closely with them to see what that learning actually looks like. I'm going to be brief in this final section. So there are a number of other papers that I do think are really helpful in terms of thinking about the renewed educational objectives. I think there are a number of frameworks that we could look at, but, you know, thinking about additional skills or these human competencies that many of the scholars and also the you know, AI CEOs talk about being important, I think it's quite important for us to think about where we teach those and how we develop them. There's also this question of what else students might be losing from both their experience and their learning when they start to use AI. And there was a paper in 2024 on Harvard undergraduates that showed that, you know, almost, well, this number has gone up by now, I'm sure, but at the time, 90% of them admitting to using generative AI, but also a quarter of those were not using office hours. They were not asking staff for help. They were not completing the readings. Most of our students don't go to the library. And they were often doing this because they felt more comfortable just working in isolation with Gen AI. I think you know, the learning experience is very multifaceted, and we design our universities to offer a number of support services, and also, I guess, aspects of the hidden curriculum that are developed through students engaging with these wider aspects of the university. And if we're not considering how their use of AI is perhaps compromising their engagement with those services and their ability to benefit from that learning that occurs in these other areas, we are potentially distorting their entire experience. So I think it's important for us to really understand how large language models work. And I would say that, perhaps quite a controversial opinion, I don't, you know, like I said, I'm not a computer scientist, and I don't think we have to have an expert knowledge of it, but I do think we have to understand how these models work in a very basic way. I think this is perhaps not the best forum to say that. I'm sure you will have slightly more knowledge than many of our colleagues, but many colleagues still don't necessarily understand that these models predict words based on probabilities, not true understanding, and therefore they're really not reasoning. As a result of that, it's very hard for them to explain to students why they hallucinate, why they may not be appropriate for certain tasks, and why they might lead to answers that are very similar across the board. So I think we need to support colleagues in, you know, developing their understanding such that they can pass that on to students. Now, there was a study in October 2024, so 7th of October this came out, I think, and I found this really interesting. I was really glad to see that, you know, something like this was published, and the question was, can AI actually reason? Now, for those of you who are expert, I'm sure you would already assume the answer to be no. But again, many colleagues are not aware of how these work and why AI might lead to these kinds of results. So in this study, the authors found that AI was not reasoning. It was largely operating on a very sophisticated approach to pattern matching. And just for the benefit of anybody on the call who is not familiar with this, there is a bank of maths questions called the GSM 8K, so 8,000 questions that are used to test almost like primary school or grade school maths reasoning. And this group of authors and team developed another bank of questions where they slightly edited the words in these questions. So we had the standard questions like, Tom has 7 apples, he gives his friend 3, how many does he have? And then they developed this second set of questions called the GSM symbolic, where they slightly changed the text. So Tom has 8 mugs of tea, he gives his friend 3, how many does he have? But they also took the test a step further, where they introduced these no-op questions. And by that, they added another part of the sentence, which seemed like it was relevant, but it actually wasn't. So Tom has 5 cups of tea, but 3 of them are smaller than average. He gives 2 to a friend. How many does he have? And by adding these non-relevant phrases to the text, the accuracy of these models to answer the question significantly dropped. Now, what relevance does that have to us? We, or in general, we are told that we need to teach students to prompt engineer. They need to give the models as much context as possible. That's how they're going to get the most optimal results. And actually, this test showed that if you're adding irrelevant information, you could in fact be reducing the accuracy of the result that you get. So again, it's important for us to understand how these models work, at least to a moderate degree, in order to pass that information on to the students. Now, in terms of that, there have been more recent studies about models hallucinating. And I think there's a little bit of dispute about whether these models are hallucinating more than they previously were. But overall, the New York Times conclusion on that is that they are. The more advanced the models are getting, the more the hallucinations are appearing. And this is important to us because actually, like, the speed of development of the models is not, or is outpacing our understanding of what the models are doing and why. And as educators, I think it's important for us to bear that in mind, that at some point we really can't explain a lot of what these models are doing. So there's only so much of that information that we can transparently give to students. I'm coming to the last slide. So if anybody feels that they are at a very beginner stage, still understanding how these work and how they might impact education, King's and also a number of other institutions have created their own courses. This one is free, so free for 3 weeks if you would like to take it or to share it with colleagues. And I think it's important for us to continue to develop those within our context of our institutions and our countries and students' access and the knowledge base, perhaps, or the starting point that is normal for the courses that you teach. And finally, I think in order to really enhance learning and not distort it, we need to use these, some of the, we can afford to draw on existing frameworks like this one, which integrates our technological knowledge with pedagogical knowledge, but also content and context. And I think if we're able to start thinking about how we integrate AI within this broader frame and also be more transparent about the challenges that we're facing, we can enhance rather than distort learning. So I think I've taken up actually every minute of my time. Thank you. And I would be happy for anybody to ask me any questions or send me emails.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, our session is over, but actually, as I was informed, we will not have the last lecture for today, so we are actually not tight with our schedule. Okay. So please, any questions for either Dr. Gonsalves or Dr. O'Halloran are welcome now. Okay, maybe I will have one comment on what you said about difference in true understanding of LLMs and actually just working with probabilities. I'm always puzzled a little bit about what a true understanding is and how do we know that true understanding is so different than what these machines are doing, given that we actually do not understand fully neither our understanding nor the inner workings. We understand the inner workings of these models at some level, but as I'm a computer scientist, I think that I can say that we do not understand it fully. So I'm feeling like as the limits of the performance that these systems exhibit at one time, if they continue at this pace, I think that we will simply have to give up on proper understanding and accept, working with probabilities as equally legitimate and sound. Maybe some comment on that.
I mean, I agree with that. I think my perspective on it at the moment, though, is that across the disciplines, I think there is a very large proportion of colleagues who don't even understand this fundamental, explanation of it predicting the next word and what implications that has. So I think for now, for everybody outside of engineering and computer science, that's probably sufficient. If everybody could explain that to the students, we would have quite an equal starting point. But I think you're right that if we're really trying to keep abreast of the developments in these, then we are very soon not going to be able to explain. I mean, the black box is already very complicated, right? So I would actually say we're already there in terms of not understanding really very much, but students are using it. And I think if we're able to simply give them a little bit of insight as to what the models are doing, how they do it in principle, and what implications that has for their work and their own learning, I think that's a start for us.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you. Natalie has a question.
Yeah, hi. So I'm also doing some education in AI at the medical with the medical students. Something that I'm seeing is the lack of value in discussing with their colleagues or with us, and instead discussing with the AI. You brought it up a bit with the students feeling more comfortable not using the resources that are available for them. And I can just only say from my own experience and from studies that show that, the more you can walk fast alone, but you're going to walk farther when you're with someone else. So do you have any kind of tools to or ideas on how to facilitate this kind of collaboration with the students, even though they might be scared or not comfortable? That's how they will grow, and that's how we will get new ideas and new ways of doing something better, I think. I
think there are a few, well, there are probably many ways. A couple of the ways that I would say I use, I felt that it becomes more important to explain certain aspects of my rationale to my students. So, I've designed a curriculum that is different to what ChatGPT will produce. And there's a reason for that. Or I've structured things in a specific way in order to take you from A to B. And I feel like I've had to work harder to also build trust with them, because I think they think that ChatGPT is smarter than all of us. And in some ways, maybe it is, but at the same time, our experience in education serves specific goals. And I think we need to communicate that a little bit more to students. But I also think being honest about the aspects that we don't know, in terms of like understanding how they use it, why they would want to cut certain corners, for example, or why they might value ChatGPT for certain tasks over us. I think we could be more transparent and start to discuss, really learn from them, and also co-create new approaches with them. So I think where we don't have the answers, we need to draw on them for that knowledge. And, again, co-creation has been something that we've spoken about for many years, and we do use it very well in some places in higher education, but we could certainly afford to use more of it. And sometimes that's a case of just sitting with students for an hour. But I think the transparency, that we're trying to work this out in real time as well, that actually students are very generous with their time and their opinions when we ask them for it. So we could afford to leverage that base of knowledge a bit more.
Yeah, I agree. When you give them something that is understandable, it will be more acceptable for them than when there's nothing to kind of grasp at, like with the AI or with someone who just tells them to do something without really understanding it. So yeah, the transparency is very important. Thanks.
Thank you. It's a great question, though.
Professor Francesco.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much for the presentation. And as I told the beginnings of this symposium, AI in education is very, very important for the Circuit Alliance. So I think that's the two talks were very interesting from this perspective. And I was very surprised in this sense that I talked with some colleagues at the University of Pisa, but also in other universities. And normally they are very afraid about the use of generative AI in teaching and in learning. But I just capture from the two talks that you are quite positive about the use of generative AI in this process. I would like just to have some comments from this perspective for both of you, because really this aspect is very relevant today. And I think that we should really work in giving some answers, at least in terms of this alliance, just for the 9 universities, but not only, of course. Thank you.
Maybe Kieran, if you want to go first this time.
Yeah. So you're asking about the positivity of uptake of generative AI in a university. Is that the point? Yeah. I mean, my view, and it follows on from the philosophical perspective that I was outlining, is that the university definitely needs to engage with AI. Okay, it can't be done in this sort of piecemeal way, where individual lecturers are getting enthused about it, and some are really, engaging with AI and integrating into their pedagogies, but others aren't. And I know this from talking to colleagues who, as I mentioned this in my talk, I've got a good friend who can't stand it, doesn't want to get involved with AI. There's a lot of technophobic or relatively technophobic lecturers, because we're interested in AI, thus we must be engaged with technology, even though the technology of generative AI is quite simple. It's surprising how many people are rather foxed by it. They say, I can't get my head around this interface, okay, where it's obviously a very simple interface. So, I don't, it's moving so quickly, and universities were taken by surprise. And I think universities are surprised how many lecturers are not as technophilic as you would expect, given that we're all engaged in technology. You can't avoid technology in learning, but most people sort of get their heads around, using like this sort of technology and so on, but they're just not engaging with generative AI. And so the only way around that is to follow. There are other universities in the world that really are gung-ho about it. They're integrating it from first-year level. That's what I think needs to happen. There needs to be some sort of core first-year program in generative AI literacy, so that inevitably starts to percolate up. It means all lecturers have to be aware of what's going on, say at a first-year curriculum, which could, I don't know how feasible that is across an entire university. It'd be great if it could be just one module, but if it's just in the humanities, or then in the social sciences, and then in the sciences, and so on, at least it's going to have a broader percolating effect, where eventually the kind of more technophilic lecturer just has to engage, all right? And obviously has to have support from the university to engage with the tools. But at the moment, my impression, and it is an impression, is that it's not sustainable, this sort of some opting in from lecturers, some opting out, and without the university direction, the opting out lecturer doesn't have to bother, right? And it's not good for the student because they're not getting that AI literacy engagement. So sorry, Chahna.
No, it's fine. I think this is a great question. And I do think I'm biased as a marketing lecturer, because I think not only through my interest in large language models, and, my research took me a lot into persuasion and consumer reviews, but for me, I see enormous potential in generative AI. And I think, it's a tool for efficiency, and it's also a catalyst for creativity and strategy and critical thinking. And I like the fact that we haven't necessarily understood what that looks like just yet. You know, we're all discovering that together. But I think the way that it's transforming industry is really interesting to me. And I think it would be unrealistic and unfair to shield students from that. So I am personally supportive of trying to learn with them about how we can best integrate it. But, you know, I agree with practitioners that I want my students to be employable when they leave. And if academia falls apart, I would also like to be employable in practice, you know, so I'd like to understand what's happening with that. So for us, I think it's really important for us to think about how we can use it thoughtfully and ethically, but also with this real critical eye. And I think we're best placed to do that as researchers and experienced educators. And I think, you know, treating it as a partner in that sense is really important so that we can all learn together and even understand where that learning might hit a wall, but we need to be informed at least, right?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe just one more short question, if there is any. If not, I would like to thank our participants for King's College very much for the exciting lectures and discussion.